In this talk about garden rewilding, I'm going to talk about some of the things I've done over the last 16 years to turn my rather barren and open rural garden into a small wildlife haven. It's a very personal account, and given my rural location, not everything I have done will be relevant to more urban settings or gardens in different parts of the northeast.
I'll be talking about gardening from an ecological and habitat perspective rather than a horticultural one. There are already many books about encouraging wildlife into your garden written by horticulturalists and gardeners, but not many written by ecologists, though I can thoroughly recommend The Garden Jungle by Dave Goulson, who is a professor of biology at the University of Sussex. Another good local resource is Creating Environmentally Friendly Gardens, written by the late Bob Davis. This is no longer in print, but a scanned PDF is available on the Nesbitt website. This booklet is a mine of information and is tailored to the species and growing conditions of the northeast of Scotland and written by one of the foremost local nature experts. The Royal Horticultural Society Guide to Wildlife Gardening by Kate Bradbury is another good source of up-to-date information. All gardening is about human intervention. Traditionally, it's been about imposing our will on nature and controlling what grows there. Gardening for wildlife has become popular in recent years with a focus on garden features that benefit wildlife such as plants for pollinators, ponds, bird boxes, bug hotels and so on. Rewilding expands on this with a mindset that puts nature and natural processes first. To rewild a garden is to look at the land from nature's point of view and allow nature to take the lead wherever possible. From woodlands and scrub to grassland, wetlands and more, large natural landscapes contain many types of habitat. A garden, on the other hand, may have just one or two, but it can mimic the structure of wilder places with dips and hollows, water and insect-friendly plants at different heights. Now, we moved to Aberdeenshire from Midlothian in spring 2004. We live in a rural location near Old Meldrum. The small settlement we live in is surrounded by farmland, which is mostly under winter barley and grass for silage, with occasional crops of oilseed rape. This is typical for the land to the north and east of the A96, which is amongst the most productive farmland in Scotland, with a land capability class of 2 and 3. The land is farmed intensively for the nation's food production, but this does leave little room for nature. On moving here from Midlothian, I was struck by the lack of woodland or scrub and anything resembling a near natural habitat. Walks around the neighbouring fields revealed hardly any wildflowers and few insects in the field margins. There were no hedges, and even the ditches provided few opportunities for wildlife. The sown grass lays are mostly fescues and ryegrass, with little clover and no wildflowers. What woodland patches exist are often small plantations of Sitka spruce. In the UK, there are around 140,000 hectares of gardens, which is slightly smaller than the area of the Cairngorms National Park. Gardens, therefore, give us a huge potential area of wildlife habitat. In Aberdeenshire, more than a quarter of households live in rural properties outside of towns and villages. Most of these have potential for providing some good wildlife habitat. Many rural properties, however, provide no improvements for wildlife over the intensive farmland that surrounds them. Our garden was like this when we moved in 16 years ago. I live in a converted steading in a farmyard complex with 2 other houses, another steading and the original farmhouse. Each house has its own garden, and there are community maintained areas of the former farmyard and along the access tracks. The neighbours are also very environmentally aware. The garden is divided into zones, with the most gardened areas near the house, getting progressively wilder the further away from the house you go. There is a bed of traditional cottage garden perennials surrounding a seating area, and this transitions into the productive garden with fruit bushes and a small vegetable patch. The pond is here too. This area is bordered by a wild hedge of native berry-bearing species and a small burn. Further up the garden, we have an area where we tried to grow an orchard with apples and plums, but these didn't do very well in the poorly drained ground. So we have created a wildflower meadow here. At the top of the garden, along an old farm access track, we have planted an area of willow and alder scrub. My strategy has been to provide habitat that would naturally be here if the land wasn't farmed so intensively. I don't have the large area needed for planting a new woodland, but I have been able to plant a shelter belt, hedges, small areas of willow scrub, burnside wet habitat, and a small wildflower grassland area. My hope was that these habitats would be suitable for native insects, birds, and small mammals, and would also act as a habitat network to enable species to move through this intensively farmed barren area. There is no point in trying to grow plants that won't tolerate the northeast climate and the heavy, mildly acidic Aberdeenshire clay soil. Nor is there any point in trying to attract animal species that wouldn't naturally occur in an arable farmland environment. In 2004, our garden was very bare and devoid of any habitat of much value. There were several mature ash trees, some with holes occupied by tree sparrows and blue tits. A small area of lawn had been laid with slab paths, and a few non-native shrubs had been planted, so there was plenty of room for improvement. Leylandii hedging had been planted along the main access track and around part of the garden. I don't like Leylandii hedging, especially in a rural area, and removed a lot of it within a month of moving in. Leylandii is good for providing shelter for nesting and roosting birds and for spiders, but it provides very little food for any invertebrates when compared to native species of trees and shrubs. Invertebrates like earthworms, insects, spiders, mollusks and crustaceans are at the base of the terrestrial food webs, and other animals such as birds, amphibians, reptiles and mammals depend upon them. It is estimated that an adult blue tit needs to find around 10,000 caterpillars to feed the young during the 20 days before they fledge. And even seed-eating birds like many finches depend on insects to feed their young, as this food is high in proteins and fat needed by the growing chicks. The famous biologist Ed Wilson said the invertebrates are the little things that run the world. To be good wildlife gardeners, we need to attract many invertebrates into our gardens to provide food for the creatures higher up the food chain. To do this, we need to ensure that we use as many native species of plants in our gardens as possible. Our native plants co-evolved with our native insects, and research has shown that our native trees and shrubs provide food for a huge array of invertebrate species when compared to non-native ornamental species. For example, 450 different invertebrate species have been recorded feeding on willows, more than 330 on birch, and even the humble bramble supports more than 100 species. If possible, it is best to use as many species of native trees and shrubs to provide the structure of your garden, and add a few foreign ornamental species for added interest. We should avoid the use of pesticides and herbicides in our gardens too. As well as reducing the numbers of available food insects, pollinators and other invertebrates, pesticides can cause problems for animals higher up the food chain. Rodenticides are known to affect birds of prey. Organochlorines and organophosphates can poison birds and aquatic life, and slug pellets can affect hedgehogs. A couple of years ago, I noticed a swarm of pine sawfly larvae eating the new growth on a Pinus mugo I had growing in a container. A couple of days later, a flock of sparrows descended and ate most of the larvae, and the following year the pine recovered. A lot of attention is currently given to providing advice on plants to grow to attract butterflies and other pollinating insects to the garden, such as growing a buddleia bush to attract butterflies. Though this advice is welcome and helps to raise awareness of the importance of insects, a lot of the advice is incomplete and ignores the often complex life cycles that many species have. For example, buddleias, Michaelmas daisies and sedum are good sources of nectar for butterflies, but you won't get many butterflies in your garden unless there is a nearby source of food for the larval stages of the caterpillars. Many butterflies and moths have particular larval food plants, such as nettles or sorrel, many of which are considered weeds by gardeners. It is important to remember that many invertebrates require different habitats at different stages of their life cycles. For instance, some hoverfly larvae require damp, rotten wood, whilst others require stagnant pools of water or grass tussocks. So by providing pools, ponds, log piles and areas of long grass, you are creating homes for these species and many others. Ponds are of course valuable homes for frogs and newts, aquatic insects like dragonflies and water beetles, and are a source of drinking water for mammals, birds and bees. Ensure that within your pond you grow some emergent plants like reeds or irises to allow the larvae of draggle and damselflies to crawl out of the water to transform into adults. It is important to think about the structure of the habitat you are creating. It is good to have a diversity of structure with dense twiggy hedges to provide shelter and nesting sites, some shrubs to simulate a scrub habitat, and open areas with long grass, shorter vegetation and some bare soil. Don't neglect your garden and house walls either. If your masonry is suitable, you can grow shrubs and climbers against walls or fences. Dry stone walls in the garden also make excellent habitats for wrens, bumblebees, reptiles and small mammals. I replaced the Leylandii with a hedge of mixed native tree species, mostly hawthorn, with bird cherry, blackthorn, elder, rowan, gean, hazel and holly. These are trimmed only every couple of years to allow them to flower and to fruit, to provide food for small mammals and birds, as well as nesting habitat and shelter. I have planted climbers like ivy, wild rose and honeysuckle in the hedge to add colour and a source of nectar and fruit. Ivy in particular creates a fantastic habitat, full of spiders and other invertebrates. It provides an excellent nesting site for a variety of birds, and I have had blackbirds, thrushes, wood pigeons, wrens and spotted flycatchers nesting in the ivy in my garden. Ivy flowers in late autumn and winter and is a good source of nectar at a time when nectar is scarce. The berries are also very high in energy and are sought after by thrushes and blackbirds. In the wetter areas by the burn, I have planted some dispersed clumps of willow and alder trees to create a wet scrub habitat. As a group of species, willows provide food for more invertebrates than even oak trees, with 450 species recorded feeding on them. Alders, too, are good for invertebrates, with 140 species recorded feeding on them. It is rare to find an alder leaf that doesn't have holes by late summer where some insect has been feeding on it. Alder leaves break down quickly and add nitrogen to the soil and provide food for aquatic insects when they fall into the water. Scrub is a much maligned habitat, detested by farmers, foresters and gardeners alike, and is often prefixed by the word worthless. In terms of its wildlife value, that could not be further from the truth, however. Areas of small trees and shrubs like hawthorn, blackthorn, bramble, gorse and willows, interspersed with open grassy areas, create a mosaic of different habitats which are valuable for invertebrates, reptiles, birds and mammals. Many of our native species have evolved to live in a woodland edge or scrub-like habitats, and this is important to bear in mind when creating habitats in your garden. A shrub border is a good proxy for native scrub, and all the more so if you include berry-bearing ornamental species such as pyracanthus or cotoneaster. The final area I want to talk about are the wildflower areas. The first of these was created in the orchard, where due to the poor drainage, the fruit trees never flourished. I have introduced plug plants of devil's bit scabious, oxeye daisy, knapweed, ragged robin, and marsh woundwort into the grass. In the second area, which had been rank tussocky grass, I strimmed heavily for 2 years and waited to see what flowers came up by themselves. I was rewarded with bush vetch, meadow vetchling, ribwort plantain, and greater bird's foot trefoil. The following autumn, I added yellow rattle seeds to weaken the grass and help more flowers get established. I mow these areas with a scythe in late autumn and rake off the cuttings. The results of all this work has been an increase in the number of birds visiting the garden, and we have recorded 32 species visiting us. As well as the usual farmland and garden birds, we get woodland visitors like tree creepers and great spotted woodpeckers that call in on flights between nearby patches of woodland, demonstrating the need for creating habitat networks. We also get the occasional red squirrel as they move between woods. The abundance of bumblebees has increased dramatically in the wildflower areas, and we have had sightings of small heath and small copper butterflies. Mammalian visitors include badger, fox, roe deer, wood mouse, field vole, and both species of pipistrelle bat.